Storm Amy's gone, and instead this week there's a lot of high pressure around. But with that, yes, there will be some rain at times, and also quite a bit of cloud and maybe even a bit of fog at times too, which could be locally thick. Hello, yes, I'm Alex Burkill, presenter and meteorologist. Thank you for joining me for this week's deep dive, and as always I'm coming to you from our headquarters here in Exeter. And also, as always, if you have any comments, do leave them. If there's anything that you've enjoyed that I talk about today, let me know. If there's anything that you haven't liked, well, keep that to yourself. If you have any questions that you'd maybe like me to answer in the Weather Studio Live this Friday when I'll be back with honour, well, put those in the comments and we'll be looking at them then. Also, hit the like button, hit the share button, and make sure you also subscribe so you never miss one of these great videos. But let's get going, because whilst the weather this week is nowhere near as unsettled, as impactful as what we saw particularly during the back end of last week, there is still some interesting bits that I want to talk about. But before we get onto that, let's have a little look back at Storm Amy, because it was quite a feature. Now I have the satellite and radar imagery behind me here, and oh, I've gone a bit too far, but you can see the swirl of cloud from Storm Amy that swept through as we went through Friday and continued to bring strong winds, some heavy thundery rain at times across much of the UK as we went through Saturday as well. Now, in case you weren't aware, it was a particularly deep area of low pressure, especially for the time of year. I'll come on to that in a second. But yes, what did we get? Well, in the centre of the low itself, the pressure fell to 944 hectopascals or millibars, whichever you fancy using. And we had a reading of 947.9 hectopascals at Bolter Sound in northern Scotland, which is a new October record, so 947.9. So no wonder that we had very strong winds, and very strong winds we had indeed. Magilligan in Northern Ireland had a gust of 92 miles per hour. That's a new Northern Ireland record for October. And actually, lots of stations across the country, or across Scotland in particular, and also parts of Northern Ireland, even parts of Northern England, Cumbria for example, Shap, Spade, Adam, recording their strongest October gusts on record. And lots of these sites go back decades. For example, Lossiemouth goes back 49 years. So it was a remarkably windy October day. Also worth bearing in mind, Tyree in northern Scotland had a gust of 96 miles per hour, so very windy indeed. And then the power cut out. And so it's possible, to be honest, it's quite likely that gusts were even stronger than 96 miles per hour there, but at the moment we don't have the data to back that up. Hopefully we get the internet back there later on this evening, maybe early tomorrow, and the data should be stored. So it's possible tomorrow or maybe later today, we announced that the winds were even stronger than 96 miles per hour at an official site. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But I wanted to show just how many stations broke their October record for the strongest gust. Now, I mentioned that for October, it was a particularly strong feature. And this is a difficult one to evaluate and look into, but fortunately my colleagues at NCIC and one of the chiefs, Dan Holly, have looked into it partly for me. And they've created this chart, and what it shows is instances where we've had gusts in excess of 60 knots, 69 miles per hour since 1973, recorded somewhere in the UK. And what you can see as we go through the year, the time of the year really plays a pivotal role in how common, how frequent it is that we see these events happening. So during the winter months, January, February, it's relatively common. I mean, we have a higher frequency. And then as we go down, or higher number of sites that have recorded those kind of gusts, then as we go through into the summer months, and it becomes much, much less common, as you would expect. But then, Floris stands out as a recent very strong unseasonable storm. And then Amy, in itself, when you compare it to, other years, other years and other months during deeper into autumn and into winter, even for like later October, it doesn't stand out that much. But it's kind of an outlier when it comes to how early it was in the month. So it was a severe storm. I mean, I've just told you that we had some October site records. Northern Ireland's October record as well when it came to strongest gusts was broken. So it was a very windy event, and it later led to widespread impacts. But especially for how early in October it came and how early in autumn, it was a very strong feature. We have had stronger ones in the past, slightly earlier on in the year, Ali, for example, in 2018, but nonetheless, it was a little unusual, kind of a one-in-a-year event. And for it to happen in October, early October, is a little unusual. And, well, nature's a wonderful thing, isn't it? Because you can kind of see the trend in terms of when we're more likely to see these stronger gusts of 60 knots plus. And it kind of ties in with when trees are losing their leaf, and that's quite important. I mean, evolution exists, and you could argue, probably I'm not an expert on this one, but the trees have probably developed a way to protect themselves from the stormy winter, late autumn, winter months where we get those strong winds by losing their leaves. They're then less susceptible to being blown over and to damage. Obviously, not every tree loses its leaves, but lots of them do. And so it's quite interesting that you see this trend. It's not a huge surprise, but it's interesting that you see this trend. And I think it does tie in quite nicely with the rate at which trees lose their leaves as well. So that's just a recap on Storm Amy. It brought some heavy rain, it brought some unusually strong winds for how early on in the autumn, and so no wonder that we saw some damage. But let's go on. Let's look ahead at the forecast through the next few days and delve into the detail behind the high pressure that's coming through. So we do have high pressure across the south. We also currently have a front making its way southwards across the UK. The jet stream, which I have on at the moment, very different to this time last week. Last week it was piling across the Atlantic towards us, and a pretty strong one at that. Currently it's much weaker and it's a bit further north. And so no wonder that everything's a bit quieter, a bit more settled. Not totally settled, but a bit more settled. Worth highlighting, actually, we did have some warm air around, particularly on Monday. Some stations in Scotland had their warmest October day for many years. Wick, for example, I think had its warmest October day on record. And we saw temperatures in the low 20s across many places. So that was pretty warm for early October. It's not going to be quite that warm generally as we go through this week. But nonetheless, we have a front pushing its way southwards. I'll get rid of the jet stream now. And that does have some rain on it, but nothing particularly heavy. And then as that front pushes its way southwards, yes, the high that's in the south at the moment kind of eases and clears away. But then we have another area of high pressure that's building across western parts. And this is going to be the dominating feature as we go through the back end of this week and into the weekend. And it looks like it's going to last with us for quite a while. So high pressure building. I'll just pause it there as we go through, where's this, late Wednesday. So the front that's pushing southwards at the moment, that's going to take a little while to clear across southern parts through Wednesday. So it's going to bring some clouds, something a bit damp perhaps across far southern parts, but not a huge amount of rain. Further north, the further you are away from the high, a bit blustery, maybe windy at times, and there will be some rain pushing in, maybe a little bit heavy for some places, some higher ground of Scotland, but nothing especially impactful. I think the bigger talking point generally is going to be this area of high pressure that's pushing through. Now, we often talk about high pressure, and when you get high pressure, the air is sinking, and so you often get lots of sunny skies, not a huge amount of cloud. Not quite what's going to happen this time. I think it's actually going to be quite cloudy at times as we go through this week. As we've gone further ahead, Thursday, there's another front toppling over the north of it, more rain. But even within the front, I should probably put cloud on at this point. That would help. You can see it looks like quite a murky, cloudy high. Now, towards the centre of the high itself, there will probably be some clear breaks, so some sunshine by day, some clear skies by night. But particularly around the outskirts of the high, it's looking quite cloudy and it could be quite murky. And why is this? Well, if we track back and look at what's happened, so we've had the front that's going through at the moment, then there are other fronts like I've just highlighted nearby towards the north of the UK. And if we track back or look at the track of the air that's coming towards us. Yes, we have kind of polar maritime air, but the original source is kind of coming more from the Atlantic. It's not your traditional polar maritime air, so it's not that clear, not that clear cut, in as much as there's going to be quite a lot of moisture within it. And that moisture is going to get trapped under that high. And with the light winds, it's going to be quite stagnant. And so that's why we're going to get some cloud, sticking around through the next few days. And also then worth bearing in mind, I highlighted there will be some clear breaks. I'll come on to this in a bit more detail in a second, but there will be some clear breaks around. And so then overnight, with that moisture, and we get some clear skies at times, calm winds, temperatures taking a bit of a dip, we're going to get some fog, locally dense fog at times through this week. So watch out for that as well. But let's just keep going and run through the rest of this week. High pressure then firmly in control for much of the country. Still some spots of rain, so yes, it'll be cloudy at times, yes, a bit damp at times, always most likely towards northern areas, and that's where the winds will be a bit stronger. Fronts trying to topple in, but much of the country having a pretty calm setup, albeit not wall-to-wall blue skies or anything like that. And we do need to cater for the fact that there could be a bit of fog at times. Now, I'll pause it here on Saturday because let's put our temperature on. Let's get rid of the, nope, didn't want to get rid of that, but let's get rid of the cloud as well. Now, there is some cooler air coming over the north of the high. And there's the potential, depending exactly where this high pressure is going to be sitting, there's the potential for some of this cooler air to cut into particularly eastern parts of the country, and then it may just displace the high just a little bit further towards the west. Now, no guarantee, different models want to do different things, but so just bear that in mind. I think quite likely we'll stay largely under the influence of the high and the cooler air will stay away from us, but just be aware that there is the potential as we go through this weekend, beginning of next week perhaps, that we could see some chillier air cutting in. And then with the fact that we will have some clear spells at times and generally light winds. When you add in that chillier air, by night, temperatures could get relatively low. I mean, a touch of frost in rural spots, definitely not out of the question through this week anyway. But if we get that chillier air coming in, then temperatures could be even lower. So perhaps a chillier feel, but no guarantee. I'm not especially confident on that happening. I think likely it will stay towards the northeast of us and we're stuck under this high, which could be quite well, largely fine, largely calm and not too chilly. By day, feeling relatively warm. Light winds, sunshine at this time of year, still quite warm if you get any of that. Then let's keep going before I get distracted anymore. And we have high, oh, don't need the winds. High pressure still in control, still towards the north, maybe towards the east. If we get that cutting in, could be a few showery bursts of rain. But on the whole, a lot of dry weather to come. And to be honest, it looks like that high pressure is going to stick around as we go through much of next week as well. Now here I have my probabilistic pressure trend. And what you can see through the end of this week, this weekend, and the beginning of next week, very high percentage chances for high pressure to be the dominant feature. So through Friday to Monday, it's gone with 100% on the most model runs now. 100%. And I don't think really any forecast is really 100% at the moment, but nonetheless, a very high confidence for high pressure to be the generally dominating story across the UK. And even as we go further on through much of next week, even by the following weekend, it's 87, 77% for Saturday and Sunday respectively. And so very high likelihood of high pressure sticking around as we go through, well, the next 2 weeks really. What happens thereafter? Well, some signs of more mobile setup and more mobile setup coming in, particularly across the south. So more changeable, unsettled weather developing as we go towards the end of October. But that's awfully far ahead at the moment. I think for the time being, let's just focus on the high pressure that's going to be around for a little, bang the table, for a little while. Now, let's go for a tephigram because I've talked about the fact that the high pressure is going to be quite cloudy at times, and I've explained that there's some moisture, and I've explained that it's being trapped. But what's trapping it? Well, we have something called a capping inversion as we go through this weekend. And so what you've got to think or remember is generally the temperature of the air lowers as you rise up, and that allows for parcels of air to rise and allows for cloud to develop here and there and stuff because warmer air rises up through cooler air. But when you get this capping inversion, this layer of warmer air, that stops the air from rising. It traps it below it. What I have is a tephigram. If you've not seen a tephigram before, I keep saying this every time I bring a tephigram on a deep dive. I would love to go through them in more detail, but today's not the day. But what we have in the black solid line, that is our air temperature, our dry bulb temperature. And then the dotted line is our dew point temperature. So remember, your dew point temperature is the temperature at which the air needs to be cooled down to, if you keep pressure the same, for it to reach 100% humidity, so fully saturated. And what you can see then, this is going up through the atmosphere. And don't worry that the lines are skewed. The isotherms, the lines of equal temperature, they skew off that way just because otherwise your graph would go, because the temperature drops as you go up through the atmosphere, it would go off that way. So we counter that with a tephigram by doing it that way. Anyway, my point is, at around, where are we, 950, about 800,000 metres up, we're looking at a capping inversion as we go through this weekend. And so that's doing a couple of things. It's trapping that moisture that I mentioned, that is around because of the setup they've had leading up to this high pressure building, and because the air's coming from across the Atlantic and that kind of thing. It's trapping that moisture in a relatively small layer of the atmosphere. So we're talking the bottom like 1,000 meters or so. And so, do I mean 1,000? Yeah, roughly. And so if this wasn't there, then all that moisture would be spread out over a much thicker layer of the atmosphere, and so that would mean there'd be less cloud in general. But because it's trapped so low down, it's a much smaller layer of the a much thicker amount of cloud that will be around. And you can see that as well when you compare the dew point and the air temperature. They're very close together, so the dew point depression's close to zero, if not zero, and so that means we're going to be getting a lot of cloud. This is profile for this coming weekend. I can't remember exactly where it was for. But if we look at another profile, again for this weekend, but perhaps slightly closer towards the centre of the high, and it still has this inversion, so there's still some of that moisture is trapped down, but the dew point depression is a bit bigger, so there's this spread, and so there's the potential for some clear breaks to develop. So I do think there will be some sunshine, some clear spells by night, some sunshine by day, but not everywhere. I think it will be quite cloudy at times as well. And this is really difficult to forecast because, well, several reasons. One, because, I mean, if it was wet and if it was windy, the rain and the wind, they would take a priority. They would be more important for us to, nail, get right, and they'd be more noticeable. So it's only really in a setup like this where we have the high pressure and the calm setup and not a huge amount of rain, not especially strong winds. It's only in a setup like this that people really notice if the cloud forecast is right or wrong. And it is important, very important, especially at a time like this, because it will play a big role in how warm, how cold it will get. So, during the day at the moment, if you're stuck under the cloud, a bit of a fresh, cool feel to things. If you get some sunshine with the light winds, feeling pretty warm. And then conversely at night, the fact if you have cloud or not could be the difference between you getting a touch of frost or it being a pretty mild night. And so the fact that it's quite tricky to forecast this cloud is a bit of an issue. But why is it so tricky? Well, if we think that this is quite a thin layer of cloud that I'm suggesting here, not particularly thick one, and so in the grand scheme of things, when you compare it to the whole layer of air that we're forecasting for, remember this is all forecast data, it's actually quite a small amount. Now we only have a finite number of levels that we split the atmosphere into when it comes to forecasting. So if you remember, when it comes to our supercomputers, we split the world into a grid, and we forecast the information, the weather factors for each individual square. We do that then in layers through the atmosphere as well, so all the squares through the atmosphere as well. But we can only split it into so many. The more we do, the more supercomputer power it takes, the longer it will take for us to get the data, and the less useful it will become. So we have to make a decision based on power as to how many levels we split it up into. Now, if we're trying to forecast cloud through all this much layer, then we have lots of information, lots of levels. But because we're only trying to forecast the cloud through a relatively small layer of the atmosphere right near the ground, we have much fewer. And so just small changes would have a big impact on how much cloud would be forecast or not. So that's why it becomes trickier in a setup like this. So I hope that makes some sense. So there will be a fair bit of cloud at times with this high pressure that we have across us through the end of the week and into the weekend. There will also be some clear spells. Chasing the clear spells and the cloud will be our job through this week. And then that will also play a role in when we see fog developing. Now, fog warnings are notoriously difficult to get out hugely in advance. We will most likely need some fog warnings through this week, but quite likely that there'll be short notice ones. So we'll start to see where the cloud breaks are, where we're seeing the fog developing. Now, we'll know the prone spots as to where we're more likely to see it, depending on the setup. So there'll be where we're keeping a closer eye on. But yeah, just be prepared as we go through this week. There's a reasonable chance that we will need some fog warnings. So stay up to date with those. Right. Oh, one other thing that I want to talk to you about with regards to this week's weather. Now, there is a low developing, which has been highlighted by the National Hurricane Centre out in the Atlantic, and they've gone with a 90% chance of it developing into a tropical storm. Now, if you cast your mind back to last week, we had Imelda, yes, but also Umberto, which developed into a hurricane, and then it was Umberto that fed into what became Storm Amy. They were different features, which is why we called it Storm Amy, not Storm Umberto, because it was a separate low that developed. But it did get some of the energy from Umberto, which then led to it partly being such a deep low, like I said, for the time of year. But this one, I mean, there are similarities between how this and Umberto initially developed, but this one looks like it will track northwestwards and then, yes, come back northeastwards towards the UK, obviously weakening depending on how far it develops anyway as it comes towards us. But at the moment, it looks like the high pressure, the blocking high across the UK will stop it coming towards us. And so although there's a potential that it will come closer to us, it really doesn't look like it will bring any impacts like Storm Amy. And so it's whilst initially there are similarities to Umberto a week or so ago, in reality, the end result is going to look pretty different for the UK because of the blocking high that we have across us. Fab. Last thing then, moons. Let's talk about it. There is a full moon tonight, and it's going to be a supermoon. So it's actually the first supermoon of the year. And interestingly, it's the first of 3 consecutive months where we have a supermoon. So October, November, and December will all have supermoons. So we haven't had any, and then we get 3 to end the year. They're a bit like buses, I guess you could say. So supermoons, it will appear about 14% bigger and about 30% brighter than a usual moon. And this one is called the harvest moon. The full moon in October is also known as the hunter moon, but it's called the harvest moon because it comes closest to the autumn equinox. And a few things about that. Actually, interestingly, at this time of year, the time at which the moon rises, the change in time at which the moon rises is less at this time of year than it is during the rest of the year. The average through the rest of the year is around 50 minutes, so it gets 50 minutes later each day. But at this time of year, it's much less than that. And that's part of the reason why it gets its name as the harvest moon, because traditionally the bright moon in the sky close to the equinox, it rises at a similar time each evening. I think it's around 20 past 6. Through Tuesday evening that it's going to be rising, and it will only be a few minutes later through Wednesday evening and so on. And because it's rising at a similar time each evening, you get a lot of that moonlight, which helps you when it comes to the harvest, helps you when it comes to hunting, etc. And so it was really seen as a big benefit. So the closest moon, full moon to the autumn equinox is called the harvest moon. This year is going to be a supermoon, and there's a reasonable chance that quite a few of us will get a chance to see it. Not everywhere, because as I mentioned, there is a front pushing through. So if I just dart ahead, let's go to 20 past 6. Roughly. So we have a front lingering across parts of northern England into North Wales. So it's going to be cloudy, it's going to be wet here. So not great visibility for seeing the supermoon here. But across much of Scotland, some clearer skies in between a few showery bursts across Northern Ireland, some fairly lengthy clear spells, and some clear breaks across central southern parts of England and Wales, but not a huge amount. So the best chance of viewing it will be across the north. But like I said, the moon rises at a very similar time on Wednesday night, and actually for much of England and Wales, much clearer skies. So whilst technically the full moon's tonight, and that's when the moon will perhaps be bigger, it's still going to be very big in the sky compared to usual as we go through Wednesday night and for the next couple of nights. So if you don't get a chance to see it tonight, then just bear that in mind. The other thing to factor in, I think there's a reasonable chance of seeing the aurora across the far north of Scotland tonight. Now, just to go back, we actually have often quite clear skies, so that's good news, but the bright full moon will make it a little bit harder, because if you have tried to spot the northern lights in the past, the advice is, you know, go somewhere dark, let your eyes adjust and look up, but or look north, but with the bright full moon, that might make that a little bit tricky. So no matter what, if you do take any photos of the moon looking impressively big or impressively bright, do share them with us here at the Met Office across our social media. And like I said at the start as well, if you happen to go up over any hills and mountains, did I even mention that? Did I talk about when it came to the inversion? Apologies if I did. I've lost my train of thoughts. But I think one thing that I wanted to highlight as well, with this capping inversion that I mentioned for this weekend, with this being around 1,000 metres up, there are hills and mountains which are higher than this. I mean, what Ben Nevis is around 4,400 feet up. And so there's a reasonable chance if you go to some of the higher peaks across the hills and mountains around the UK this weekend, although there'll be cloud closer to the ground, you could actually climb above the cloud and then be looking out over the cloud. You'll have largely sunny skies. I mean, look how dry it is once you get above that inversion. So lots of clear skies, lots of bright sunny weather. So yeah, could be quite a nice day or nice setup for going up some hills and mountains. So if you take any photos of that or the supermoon, sorry, I digressed, then do share those photos with us. I'd love to see them. Right. I meant to mention that earlier, but don't worry, I got there in the end. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. Like I said, if you have any questions, do hit them in the comments and I'll try and look at some of them in time for the Weather Studio Live on Friday. Honor and I will be back 12:15 as always. Honor will be doing the 10-day trend tomorrow, so worth checking that out. She'll have more detail about how the high pressure is developing. Maybe she'll have a slightly better idea of when and where we could see any fog. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your week and I'll see you again soon.